your talents have gone beyond the mere physical level. Your skills are now at the point of spiritual insight. What is the highest technique you hope to achieve?
To have no technique. To have no technique.
Very good. What are your thoughts when facing an opponent?
There is no opponent. Because the word I does not exist. It does not exist. There is no opponent. Because the word I does not exist. It does not exist. A good fight should be like a small play, but played seriously. A good martial artist does not become tense, but ready. Ready. Not thinking yet, not dreaming. Ready for whatever may come. There is no opponent. Because the word I does not exist. It does not exist. There is no opponent. Because the word I does not exist. It does not exist. When the opponent expands, I contract. When it contracts, I expand. And when there is an opportunity, I do not hit. It hits all by itself. It hits all by itself. It hits all by itself. It hits all by itself.
There were farmers that marched through the South side by side beneath socialist banners to push back the tide. For the banks took their homes and the dust piled high. Well, a new world was envisioned. There were co-ops and unions that challenged the Grange, that blew like a cyclone across the Great Plains. They tried to erase and they tried to contain and divide you with racism. But you have no country, your conscience rang clear. I refuse to believe that it can't happen here. They tied you up with their thickest chains, but your ideals escape them. When your strikes hit the streets for the 8-hour day with your dynamite sticks and your signs on display, we remember you still on the first day of May and the words you fought and died for. When the Russians rose to challenge the Tsar, you met in Chicago and answered the call. When Zapata and Pancho Villa took arms, well, you rode right there beside them. And you have no country, your conscience rang clear. I refuse to believe that it can't happen here. They tied you up with their thickest chains, but your ideals escaped them. Now I grant you your labor, your hard-working hands too often fell under generals' commands, and the ships that sailed to invade other lands, you refused to march beside them. Came the deportations, the rumors, the clubs, the blacklist spies, the gallows and guns. They tried all of these to silence your cause, but you kept for hate, and the TV and radio preaches the same, and the snake oil salesman still plays the same game that he played 100 years ago. Well, they stole your history and covered their tracks, so your kids and your grandkids could never look back to a time when our ancestors stood and fought back against exploitation and bigotry. And you have no country, your conscience rang clear. I refuse to believe that it can't happen here. They tied you up with their thickest chains, but your ideals escape them. And you have no country, your conscience rang clear. I refuse to believe that it can't happen here. They tied you up with their thickest chains, but your ideals escape them.
Daniel Allen Baker came back from the war, seen the bloody oil fields of what we were fighting for. The terror of the occupation over in Iraq, so he walked away from the army when they tried to send him back. Just following his orders would be in a lifetime of disgrace. He laid down the white man's burden to rejoin the human race. He'd made a promise to defend the people of this land, but the threat is here at home, in the ruling class's hands. When they say to put your hands up, that's when you gotta stand up, and we'll fight to hold our ground. That's how it's gotta be, keeping a watch around the fire for the ones behind the wire. Daniel fought for freedom, and we'll fight to set him free. Syria exploded, and the dam of war had broke, and the state that they call ISIS came rising from the smoke. A monster born of decades of wars across the sea. To help protect the people, Daniel joined the YPG. He trained with them in Rojava with the skills the army taught. No more tool of empire, but for battles to be fought. To defend a revolution that grew out of the ash. The world turned its back, Daniel charged into the clash. When they say to put your hands up, that's when you've gotta stand up, and we'll fight to hold our ground. That's how it's gotta be, keeping a watch around the fire, the ones behind the wire. Daniel fought for freedom, and we'll fight to set him free. Trump lost the election, he peddled his big lie. He told his black and yellow shirts to stand back and stand by. He swore he would go out, not with a whimper but a roar, as goons broke down the windows to invade the Senate floor. The violence they had rocking other lands and in our streets, now they hurled at the Congress to reverse their Don's defeat. Police let them leave, just arrested a few men where the right had tasted power. They swore they'd try again. When they say to put your hands up, that's when you gotta stand up, and we'll fight to hold our ground. That's how it's gotta be, keeping watch around the fire, ones behind the wire. Daniel fought for freedom, and we'll fight to set him free. The streets of Tallahassee lurked the shadow of the Klan. The state capitol was targeted, and the coup supporters planned. Daniel knew that fascism was empire come back home, and he knew the storms were gathering around the Capitol dome. So he printed out a flyer to raise the people in alarm. Like the right had done so many times, he made the call to arms. But the cops and Klan are hand in hand, they soon had Daniel caught. He called him a terrorist, fighting back when they would not. When they say to put your hands up, it's when you gotta stand up and we'll fight to hold our ground. That's how it's gotta be, keeping a watch around the fire. The ones behind the wire. Daniel fought for freedom and we'll fight to set it free. Daniel Allen Baker is sitting in a cell, but fascists are in Congress and uniform as well. Another POW in our growing years have led a three-way fight between the white, blue, and the red. No government fights fascism to bury it for good. They need the Klan to be their terror lurking underneath the hood. No one else can stop it for us, so together we must stand. Free our captured friend to take the future in our hands. When they say to put your hands up, that's when you've gotta stand up and we'll fight to hold our ground. That's how it's gotta be, keeping a watch around the fire. The ones behind the wire. Daniel fought for freedom and we'll fight to set it free.
Okay, so we're about to get started. I encourage you to follow along with the whole routine and make your own routine, or just watch this video every day and follow along with me every day. We're going to do meditation, then reading, then yoga, then a martial arts bodyweight workout, 30 minutes each, and I do this every day. Last week I was focused on running, so I say I do this every day. For the last several years I've done this every day, or at least 6 days a week. And you can see me live streaming most of the time when I do it. But last week I was trying to add running to the mix, and there was some drama with the neighbor next door beating his dog. So we had to handle that and stop that from happening. And adjusting to a new job. So every day after work last week, I went for a 30-minute run around the park. So that's what I did last week for my daily routine, was running 30 to 40 minutes after work, laps around the park. And I encourage you to do the same. The main points of the daily routine to improve yourself, all throughout history, this is what people have done to get stronger, faster, smarter, become better, more ethical people in the real world, not in some imaginary future or in some mythological, fictional afterlife. The way that you do it, the way that you improve yourself and become a better person, and by association improve the world around you, is you sit and meditate for 30 minutes every day, right? You sit and meditate for 30 minutes every day, then you read something 30 minutes every day. Then you do yoga, stretch your body out for 30 minutes every fucking day. And then after that, you do a martial arts workout or just a bodyweight workout. And the format of a bodyweight or martial arts workout is you do around 30 seconds to a minute of full body, then you do legs, and then upper body, then core, over and over again for at least 30 minutes. And then you go for a 30-minute run. And the 30-minute run is something that we are evolutionarily predisposed to have to do every day. And people don't do it because they're lazy and coming up with excuses. So all your excuses are bullshit. All your excuses are lies that you tell yourself and other people. So get over it and go for the run. And that's what I've been telling myself, to make myself do it. Because I haven't been running the last few years. Occasionally, but not consistently, to improve or make myself stronger, faster, healthier. So I'm doing the endurance block right now. And this daily routine that I do an endurance block, then I do a strength endurance block, then a strength block, then an explosive speed and strength, and then I do either a hybrid or I switch back to endurance, and each block lasts 2 months. So I've just given you the secret. That's how you be a stronger, faster, smarter, better person. If you're just tuning in, rewind if you want to see what we're about to do. We're about to sit for 30 minutes. I just went into detail about it, and I won't repeat myself. But we're about to sit and meditate for 30 minutes, and then read for 30 minutes, and then do yoga, and then martial arts, and then we'll go for a run. And the run won't be live streamed, because that would just be awful to watch. Phone shaking in my hand. So, yeah, right now what I'm doing is I'm writing out the workout that I'm about to do in about an hour, hour and a half, when I've finished with the meditation, reading, and yoga portions for 30 minutes each. So, last time I did my body weight workout, it was wrestling takedowns, right? And I usually go in a kind of a routine where, let's see, freestyle, hip throws. Okay, the round after I do wrestling, today I'm going to do the Sasai Sarikomiyoshi foot sweep solo drills. That's going to be the core of what makes up my body weight workout today. So, doing endurance, right? I'm going to be doing 1 minute rounds. And the first round is kickboxing, right? So I'll do full body, legs, upper body, core. And this is my log from the last week or so. All of last week, all I did was go jogging, because I'm trying to really get the jogging as a daily habit. After work, jog 30 minutes at the park. Right? As soon as I get off work, I go right down the street to the park next door, and I run 30 minutes around the park. So today is November 26th. So I'm putting 11/26, 25, and we're doing Sasai Sarikomiyoshi, which is basically you grab somebody, you step on their foot, you push them, and then you kick the foot out from under them, right? That's the essence of it. There's more details than that, but yeah. So for the kickboxing takedown, I'm going to look at what I did last time. Last time I did right hook, teep, roundhouse kick, teep, jab, cross, hook, high kick. So this time I'm going to look at my list of kickboxing combos I'm working on and go down the list to the next one. Oh, so basically I'm back at the top of the list. I'm going to do body coordination 1 from traditional martial arts, which is basically cross, jab, cross, kick over and over again. Cross, jab, cross, kick. Right? Okay. And I'm making another note. From 11:20 to 11:25, I did 30 to 40 minute runs daily. So for the last 5 days, I've been going for a run every day. And a few days before that too. So we're going to do body coordination 1 for the first round of roundhouse, the first round of kickboxing. Then we're just going to do the kicks. And then we're just going to do some boxing in the same form. And then we're going to do head movement and high knees. For the next round, we're going to do the takedowns. So we're going to do Sasai along with the kickboxing combo. And then we're just going to do the Sasai leg solo drill. And for upper body, we're going to be doing what's called pummeling, arm drag, and then also steering wheel. So that'll be a 3-minute round. And then for the core exercise, I forget what we usually do for Sasai. I gotta look back. Sometimes I combine the Sasai with the Uchimata Day, but I like to split it up. Here it says I should be doing the posture exercise. But I do that on wrestling day, so I'm going to do donkey kicks. So that's 2 rounds. That's how I've built 2 rounds right there, right? On a busy day, I just go back and look at a previous day and follow that. But I'm off work today, so I'm going to write it out in detail, what the workout rounds are going to be like. So I do a kickboxing round, I do a takedown round, and then I do a round of arm locks and leg locks, right? Joint locks, submissions. So yeah, we're going to do a combo round plus submissions. And we're going to do standing leg lock entries. For the leg round. For the upper body, we're going to do push-up to knee on belly armbar. And then we're going to do sit-up armbar from side, well, from mount really. And we're also going to do Russian twist. So that's a 2-minute round. Because the Russian twist is the movement for completing a heel hook. The next is the stranglehold round, so we're drilling solo drills that lead to strangleholds and grappling. We're going to do sprawls for the first one, for full body, right? Combo plus sprawl. Then we're going to do triangle squeeze with the leg. Then we're going to do push up to triangle from the mount or side control. Or knee on belly, really. And then we're going to do triangles from the closed guard, from the back. Then the next round after the strangle rounds is the pin escape round. It's the most important one. It's how you escape from being pinned. So we're going to break fall. And we're going to do break fall with no hands. Break fall and stand up. We're going to do forearm drags for upper body. And then we're going to do the sideways scoot and bridging and shrimping. And then a review round. So on that note, we'll begin with the meditation section. And we're not just going to meditate on nothing. We're going to listen to an audiobook. And then we're going to read from the communist newspaper stuff that's related to the audiobook we just listened to. So I've been studying Lenin and the Russian Revolution. So that's what we're going to focus on today. Where are we at? This one sounds interesting.
Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the December 2021 edition of Socialism for All. And it's an audiobook and discussion of the military program of the Proletarian Revolution from 1916 by Lenin. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. So this file was written in September 1916. It was published first in the magazine Jugend Internationale numbers 9 and 10, September and October 1917. It was first published in Russian in 1929 in the second and third editions of Lenin's collected works, volume 19, translated from the German, signed N. Lenin, and published according to the magazine text. The source is Lenin's collected works, Progress Publishers, 1964, Moscow, volume 23, translated by M.S. Levin, the late Joe Feinberg, and others, transcription by Zodiac, HTML markup by B. Baggins, D. Walters, and Kevin Goins. It's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive as of 1993, thanks as usual to the Marxists Internet Archive, which hosts the Lenin Internet Archive, at marxists.org for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So this begins with a note from the Marxists Internet Archive. It says, the military program of the Proletarian Revolution, or in a letter, Lenin refers to it as an article on disarmament. And comment from me, I have also seen it referred to in a footnote in a Maoist text as the war program of the Proletarian Revolution. It was written in German and meant for publication in the Swiss, Swedish, and Norwegian left social democratic press. However, it was not published at that time. Lenin somewhat re-edited it for publication in Russian. The article, The Disarmament Slogan, appeared in Spornik Sozialdemokrata, number 2, December 1916. The original German text appeared in Jugend Internationale, organ of the International League of Socialist Youth Organizations, numbers 9 and 10, September and October 1917, under the heading Das Militärprogramm der Proletischen Revolution. The article was reprinted with this editorial forward. In our day, when Lenin is one of the most spoken of leaders of the Russian Revolution, the following article by this veteran revolutionary stalwart, in which he sets out a large part of his political program, is of especial interest. We received it shortly before his departure from Zurich in April 1917. The heading was apparently given by the editors of Jugend Internationale. Jugend Internationale, or the Youth International, was the organ of the International League of Socialist Youth Organizations, and it was associated with the Zimmerwald left. It was published from September 1915 to May 1918 in Zurich. So, let's now begin the text, which is printed in 3 parts. Among the Dutch, Scandinavian, and Swiss revolutionary social democrats who are combating the social chauvinist lies about defense of the fatherland in the present imperialist war, there have been voices in favor of replacing the old social democratic minimum program demand for a militia, or the armed nation, by a new demand, disarmament. The Jugend Internationale has inaugurated a discussion on this issue and published, in number 3, an editorial supporting disarmament. There is also, we regret to note, a concession to the disarmament idea in R. Grimm's latest theses. Discussions have been started in the periodicals Neue Leben and Verbote. Let us take a closer look at the position of the disarmament advocates. There's a couple of footnotes there. The first reference is to Robert Grimm's thesis on the war question, published in the Grütlianer numbers 162 and 164 from July 1916, and also Neue Leben, or New Life, was a monthly journal of the Swiss Social Democratic Party, published in Bern from January 1915 to December 1917. It expressed the views of the Zimmerwald right, and early in 1917 took up a social chauvinist position. Comment from me, what is social chauvinism? So, this text is from late in World War I, and you can look back at some of the texts that Lenin wrote about opportunism and social chauvinism, like the Renegade Kautsky is a good example. Basically, what he was seeing was a split of many of the European socialist leaders to support their national bourgeoisie in World War I, whereas Lenin said that, we should not be supporting one imperialist over the other in these wars. So that was some of the disagreement that was going on there. So anyway, as Lenin said, let us take a closer look at the position of the disarmament advocates. Section 1. Their principal argument is that the disarmament demand is the clearest, most decisive, most consistent expression of the struggle against all militarism and against all war. But in this principal argument lies the disarmament advocates' principal error. Socialists cannot, without ceasing to be socialists, be opposed to all war. Firstly, socialists have never been, nor can they ever be, opposed to revolutionary wars. The bourgeoisie of the imperialist great powers has become thoroughly reactionary, and the war this bourgeoisie is now waging we regard as a reactionary, slave owners, and criminal war. But what about a war against this bourgeoisie? A war, for instance, waged by peoples oppressed by and dependent upon this bourgeoisie, or by colonial peoples for liberation. In Section 5 of the Internationale Group thesis, we read, "National wars are no longer possible in the era of this unbridled imperialism." That is obviously wrong. The history of the 20th century, this history of unbridled imperialism, is replete with colonial wars. But what we Europeans, the imperialist oppressors of the majority of all the world's peoples, sounds like Lenin's anti-white, am I right? With our habitual, despicable European chauvinism, call colonial wars, are often national wars, or national rebellions of these oppressed peoples. One of the main features of imperialism is that it accelerates capitalist development in the most backward countries, and thereby extends and intensifies the struggle against national oppression. That is a fact, and from it inevitably follows that imperialism must often give rise to national wars. Unius, who defends the above-quoted theses in her pamphlet, says that in the imperialist era, every national war against an imperialist great power leads to intervention of a rival imperialist great power. Every national war is thus turned into an imperialist war. But that argument is wrong too. This can happen, but it does not always happen. Many colonial wars between 1900 and 1914 did not follow that course. and it would be simply ridiculous to declare, for instance, that after the present war, if it ends in the utter exhaustion of all the belligerents, there can be no national progress, revolutionary wars of any kind, wages, say, by China in alliance with India, Persia, Siam, etc., against the great powers. To deny all possibility of national wars under imperialism is wrong in theory, obviously mistaken historically, and tantamount to European chauvinism in practice. We who belong to nations that oppress hundreds of millions in Europe, Africa, Asia, etc., are invited to tell the oppressed peoples that it is, quote, impossible for them to wage war against, quote, our nations. Secondly, civil war is just as much a war as any other. He who accepts the class struggle cannot fail to accept civil wars, in which every class society are the natural and under certain conditions inevitable continuation, development, and intensification of the class struggle. That has been confirmed by every great revolution. To repudiate civil war, or to forget about it, is to fall into extreme opportunism and renounce the socialist revolution. Thirdly, the victory of socialism in one country does not at one stroke eliminate all wars in general. On the contrary, it presupposes wars. The development of capitalism proceeds extremely unevenly in different countries. It cannot be otherwise under commodity production. From this, it follows irrefutably that socialism cannot achieve victory simultaneously in all countries. It will achieve victory first in one or several countries, while the others will for some time remain bourgeois or pre-bourgeois. This is bound to create not only friction, but a direct attempt on the part of the bourgeoisie of other countries to crush the socialist state's victorious proletariat. In such cases, a war on our part would be a legitimate and just war. It would be a war for socialism, for the liberation of other nations from the bourgeoisie. Engels was perfectly right when, in his letter to Kautsky of September 12, 1882, he clearly stated that it was possible for already victorious socialism to wage, quote, defensive wars. What he had in mind was defense of the victorious proletariat against the bourgeoisie of other countries. Only after we have overthrown, finally vanquished, and expropriated the bourgeoisie of the whole world, and not merely in one country, will wars become impossible. And from a scientific point of view, it would be utterly wrong and utterly unrevolutionary for us to evade or gloss over the most important things, crushing the resistance of the bourgeoisie, the most difficult task, and one demanding the greatest amount of fighting in the transition to socialism. The, quote, social parsons and opportunists are always ready to build dreams of future peaceful socialism. But the very thing that distinguishes them from revolutionary social democrats is that they refuse to think about and reflect on the fierce class struggle and class wars needed to achieve that beautiful future. We must not allow ourselves to be led astray by words. The term defense of the fatherland, for instance, is hateful to many because both avowed opportunists and Kautskyites use it to cover up and gloss over the bourgeois lie about the present predatory war. This is a fact, but it does not follow that we must no longer see through to the meaning of political slogans. To accept defense of the fatherland in the present war, comment again World War I, is no more nor less than to accept it as a just war, a war in the interests of the proletariat. No more nor less, we repeat, because invasions may occur in any war. It would be sheer folly to repudiate defense of the fatherland on the part of oppressed nations in their wars against the imperialist great powers, or on the part of a victorious proletariat in its war against some Gallifet of a bourgeois state. Theoretically, it would be absolutely wrong to forget that every war is but the continuation of policy by other means. The present imperialist war is the continuation of the imperialist policies of two groups of great powers, and these policies were engendered and fostered by the sum total of the relationships of the imperialist era. But this very era must also necessarily engender and foster policies of struggle against national oppression and of proletarian struggle against the bourgeoisie, and consequently also the possibility and inevitability, first, of revolutionary national rebellions and wars, second, of proletarian wars and rebellions against the bourgeoisie, and third, of a combination of both kinds of revolutionary war, etc. That's the end of Section 1, beginning Section 2 of the military program of the proletarian revolution. To this must be added the following general consideration. An oppressed class, which does not strive to learn to use arms, to acquire arms, only deserves to be treated like slaves. We cannot, unless we have become bourgeois pacifists or opportunists, forget that we are living in a class society from which there is no way out, nor can there be, save through the class struggle. In every class society, whether based on slavery, serfdom, or, as at present, wage labor, the oppressor class is always armed. Not only the modern standing army, but even the modern militia, and even in the most democratic bourgeois republics, like Switzerland, for instance, represent the bourgeoisie armed against the proletariat. That is such an elementary truth that it is hardly necessary to dwell upon it. Suffice it to point to the use of troops against strikers in all capitalist countries. Comment: in the United States, where did state police come from? They were strikebreakers because back in those days, early 1900s, people who were the cops were related to people who would be striking. And they a lot of times didn't want to fire on them. So they brought in state police that weren't local and were more likely to use violence against the strikers. Okay, little side note. Continuing. A bourgeoisie armed against the proletariat is one of the biggest fundamental and cardinal facts of modern capitalist society. And in face of this fact, revolutionary social democrats are urged to, quote, demand, quote, disarmament. That is tantamount to complete abandonment of the class struggle point of view, to renunciation of all thought of revolution. Our slogan must be arming of the proletariat to defeat, expropriate, and disarm the bourgeoisie. These are the only tactics possible for a revolutionary class, tactics that follow logically from and are dictated by the whole objective development of capitalist militarism. Only after the proletariat has disarmed the bourgeoisie will it be able, without betraying its world historic mission, to consign all armaments to the scrap heap. And the proletariat will undoubtedly do this, but only when this condition has been fulfilled, certainly not before. If the present war rouses among the reactionary Christian socialists, among the whimpering petty bourgeoisie, only horror and fright, only aversion to all use of arms, to bloodshed, death, etc., then we must say, capitalist society is, and has always been, horror without end. If this most reactionary of all wars is now preparing for that society an end to horror, we have no reason to fall into despair. But the disarmament demand, or more correctly, the dream of disarmament, is objectively nothing but an expression of despair at a time when, as everyone can see, the bourgeoisie itself is paving the way for the only legitimate and revolutionary war, civil war against the imperialist bourgeoisie. A lifeless theory, some might say, but we would remind them of two world historical facts: the role of the trusts and the employment of women in industry on the one hand, and the Paris Commune of 1871 and the December 1905 uprising in Russia on the other. The bourgeoisie makes it its business to promote trusts, drive women and children into the factories, subject them to corruption and suffering, condemn them to extreme poverty. We do not demand such development. We do not support it. We fight it. But how do we fight? We explain that trusts and the employment of women in industry are progressive. We don't want to return to the handicraft system, pre-monopoly capitalism, domestic drudgery for women, forward through the trusts, etc., and beyond them to socialism. Also applicable is the present militarization of the population. Today, the imperialist bourgeoisie militarizes the youth as well as the adults. Tomorrow, it may begin militarizing the women. Our attitude should be, all the better, full speed ahead, for the faster we move, the nearer shall we be to the armed uprising against capitalism. How can social democrats give way to fear of the militarization of the youth, etc., if they have not forgotten the example of the Paris Commune? This is not a lifeless theory or a dream. It is a fact. And it would be a sorry state of affairs, indeed, if, all the economic and political facts notwithstanding, social democrats began to doubt that the imperialist era and imperialist wars must inevitably bring about a repetition of such facts. A certain bourgeois observer of the Paris Commune, writing to an English newspaper in May 1871, said, "If the French nation consisted entirely of women, what a terrible nation it would be. Women and teenage children fought in the Paris Commune side by side with the men. It will be no different in the coming battles for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. Proletarian women will not look on passively as poorly armed or unarmed workers are shot down by the well-armed forces of the bourgeoisie. They will take to arms, as they did in 1871, and from the cowed nations of today, or more correctly, from the present-day labor movement, disorganized more by the opportunists than by the governments, there will undoubtedly arise, sooner or later, but with absolute certainty, an international league of the terrible nations, quote-unquote, of the revolutionary proletariat. The whole of social life is now being militarized. Imperialism is a fierce struggle of the great powers for the division and redivision of the world. It is therefore bound to lead to further militarization in all countries, even in neutral and small ones. How will proletarian women oppose this? Only by cursing all war and everything military? Only by demanding disarmament? The women of an oppressed and really revolutionary class will never accept that shameful role. They will say to their sons, "You will soon be grown up. You will be given a gun. Take it and learn the military art properly." The proletarians need this knowledge not to shoot your brothers, the workers of other countries, as is being done in the present war, and as the traitors to socialism are telling you to do. They need it to fight the bourgeoisie of their own country, to put an end to exploitation, poverty, and war, and not by pious wishes, but by defeating and disarming the bourgeoisie. If we are to shun such propaganda, precisely such propaganda, in connection with the present war, then we had better stop using fine words about international revolutionary social democracy, the socialist revolution, and war against war. That's the end of section 2, now beginning section 3. The disarmament advocates object to the, quote, armed nation clause in the program, also because it more easily leads, they allege, to concessions to opportunism. The cardinal point, namely the relation of disarmament to the class struggle and to the social revolution, we have examined above. We shall now examine the relation between the disarmament demand and opportunism. One of the chief reasons why it is unacceptable is precisely that, together with the illusions it creates, it inevitably weakens and devitalizes our struggle against opportunism. Undoubtedly, this struggle is the main, immediate question now confusing the international. Struggle against imperialism that is not closely linked with the struggle against opportunism is either an empty phrase or a fraud. One of the main defects of Simmerwald and Quintal, on the main reasons why these embryos of the Third International may possibly end in a fiasco, is that the question of fighting opportunism was not even raised openly, let alone solved, in the sense of proclaiming the need to break with the opportunists. There is a footnote there. Lenin is referring to the International Socialist Conferences at Simmerwald and Quintal. The first Zimmerwald Conference met on September 5th through 8th, 1915, and was attended by 38 delegates from 11 European countries. Lenin headed the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party Central Committee delegation. The conference adopted the manifesto to the European proletariat, in which, at the insistence of Lenin and the left Social Democrats, several basic propositions of revolutionary Marxism were included. It also adopted a joint declaration by the German and French delegations, a message of sympathy with war victims and fighters persecuted for their political activities, and elected the International Socialist Committee, ISC. The Zimmerwald Left Group was formed at this conference. It included representatives of the RSDLP Central Committee headed by Lenin, the regional executives of the Social Democratic Party of the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania, the Central Committee of the Lettish Social Democratic Party, the Swedish Left, Carl Seth Haugland, the Norwegian Left, Ture Nerman, the Swiss left, Fritz Platen, and the International Socialists of Germany group, Julius Burckhardt. The Zimmerwald left waged an active struggle against the centrist majority at the conference, but it was only the Bolsheviks among the left who advocated a fully consistent policy. The Second International Conference was held at Kiental, a village near Bern, between April 24 and 30, 1916. It was attended by 43 delegates from 10 countries. The RSDLP Central Committee was represented by Lenin and 2 other delegates. The conference discussed the following questions. 1. The struggle to end the war. 2. The attitude of the proletariat on the peace issue. 3. Agitation and propaganda. 4. Parliamentary activity. 5. Mass struggle. And 6. Convocation of the International Socialist Bureau. Led by Lenin, the Zimmerwald left was much stronger at Kiental than at the earlier Zimmerwald conference. At Kiental, it united 12 delegates, and some of its proposals obtained as many as 20 votes, or nearly half the total. This was indicative of how the internationalism in the world labor movement had changed in favor of internationalism. The conference adopted a manifesto called "To the People's Suffering, Ruination, and Death," and a resolution criticizing pacifism and the International Socialist Bureau. Lenin regarded the conference decisions as a further step in uniting the internationalist forces against the imperialist war. The Zimmerwald and Kiental conferences helped to unite the left elements in the West European social democratic movement on the principles of Marxism-Leninism. Subsequently, these left elements took an active part in founding communist parties in their countries and in organizing the Third Communist International. Back to the main text. Opportunism has triumphed, temporarily, in the European labor movement. Its 2 main shades are apparent in all the big countries. First, the avowed, cynical, and therefore less dangerous social imperialism of Messrs. Plekhanov, Scheidemann, Legin, Albert Thomas, and Semba, van der Velde, Hindman, Henderson, et al. Second, the concealed Kautskyite opportunism. Kautsky-Haas and the Social Democratic Labor Group in Germany, Longuet, Presseman, Meow, etc. in France, Ramsay MacDonald and the other leaders of the Independent Labour Party in England, Martov, Chkaitsa et al. In Russia, Trev and the other so-called left reformists in Italy. There's a footnote there. The Social Democratic Labor Group, an organization of German centrists founded in March 1916 by Reichstag members who had broken with the Social Democratic Reichstag group. It had the support of the majority of the Berlin organization and became the backbone of the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, founded in April 1917. The Reichstag, of course, is the German parliament. The new party sought to justify avowed social chauvinists and advocated preservation of unity with them. Back to the main text. Avowed opportunism is openly and directly opposed to revolution and to incipient revolutionary movements and outbursts. It is in direct alliance with the governments, varied as the forms of this alliance may be, from accepting ministerial posts to participation in the war industries committees in Russia. There's a footnote there. The war industries committees were established in Russia in May 1915 by the imperialist bourgeoisie to help the Tsarist government in the prosecution of the war. The Central War Industry Committee was headed by one of Russia's biggest capitalists, Guchkov, leader of the Octobrists. In an attempt to bring the workers under their influence and to foster chauvinist sentiments, the bourgeoisie decided to organize, quote, workers' groups in these committees, thereby creating the impression that a class peace had been achieved in Russia between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The Bolsheviks declared a boycott of the committees and successfully carried it out with the support of the majority of workers. As a result of Bolshevik propaganda, elections to the workers' groups, quote unquote, were held only in 70 out of a total of 239 regional and local committees, and workers' representatives were elected only in 36 of them. Back to the main text. The masked opportunists, the Kautskyites, are much more harmful and dangerous to the labor movement because they hide their advocacy of alliance with the former under a cloak of plausible pseudo-Marxist catchwords and pacifist slogans. Comment from me: if you want a good example of Kautskyism in the present day, look at Bosch. A cloak of plausible pseudo-Marxist catchwords and pacifist slogans which are really intended to cloak an alliance with the bourgeoisie. Continuing. The fight against both these forms of prevailing opportunism must be conducted in all fields of proletarian politics: parliament, the trade unions, strikes, the armed forces, etc. The main distinguishing feature of both these forms of prevailing opportunism is the concrete question of the connection between the present war and revolution, and the other concrete questions of revolution are hushed up, concealed, or treated with an eye to police prohibitions. And this despite the fact that before the war, the connection between this impending war and the proletarian revolution was emphasized innumerable times, both unofficially and officially, in the Basel Manifesto. There's a footnote there. The Basel Manifesto was a manifesto on the war issue. It was adopted at the Extraordinary International Socialist Congress held in Basel on November 24 to 25, 1912. If you're interested in that, we have an audiobook of it up here at Socialism for All. Back to the main text. The main defect of the disarmament demand is its evasion of all the concrete questions of revolution. Or do the advocates of disarmament stand for an altogether new kind of revolution, unarmed revolution? To proceed, we are by no means opposed to the fight for reforms, and we do not wish to ignore the sad possibility, if the worst comes to the worst, of mankind going through a second imperialist war. Comment, of course they did. If revolution does not come out of the present war in spite of our efforts. We favor a program of reforms directed also against the opportunists. They would be only too glad if we left the struggle for reforms entirely to them and sought escape from sad reality in a nebulous, quote, disarmament fantasy. Disarmament means simply running away from unpleasant reality, not fighting it. In such a program, we would say something like, to accept the defense of the fatherland slogan in the 1914-16 imperialist war is to corrupt the labor movement with the aid of a bourgeois lie. Such a concrete reply to a concrete question would be more correct theoretically, much more useful to the proletariat, and more unbearable to the opportunists than the disarmament demand and repudiation of any and all defense of the fatherland. And we would add, the bourgeoisie of all the imperialist great powers, England, France, Germany, Austria, Russia, Japan, the United States, has become so reactionary and so intent on world domination that any war waged by the bourgeoisie of those countries is bound to be reactionary. The proletariat must not only oppose all such wars, but must also wish for the defeat of its, quote, own government in such wars, and utilize its defeat for revolutionary insurrection, if an insurrection to prevent the war proves unsuccessful. On the question of a militia, we should say we are not in favor of a bourgeois militia. We are in favor only of a proletarian militia. Therefore, not a penny, not a man, not only for a standing army, but even for a bourgeois militia, even in countries like the United States or Switzerland, Norway, etc. Let me read that again. Even for a bourgeois militia, even in countries like the United States, when people try to do the boogaloo thing or whatever, these are right-wing bourgeois militias. Okay. The more so that in the freest Republican countries, e.g. Switzerland.
So on that note,
We see that the militia...
we will pause this and we'll come back to the audiobook after I do some reading. So we've just sat for 30 minutes meditation on, in this case, we're just sitting and listening, focusing on the breath. We're listening to the military program of the Proletarian Revolution by Lenin. Sorry. Now we're going to read from the communist newspaper. So I'll bring this in so you can hear me better. See our little buddy here. So this is the November and December issue, 2025, of the Communist newspaper, publication of the Revolutionary Communists of America. Murmurs of a jobs bloodbath is growing louder. Corporate executives are resorting to doomsday language to warn of the destructive effects AI could have on tomorrow's job market. This summer, Anthropic CEO Dario Amati warned that AI could wipe out half of all entry-level white-collar jobs and spike unemployment to 10 to 20% in the next 1 to 5 years. The CEO went on record to urge businesses and the government to stop sugarcoating the possible mass elimination of jobs across the economy. Quote, "We, as the producers of this technology, have a duty and an obligation to be honest about what is coming." End quote. Axios published his comments under the headline, "AI Jobs Danger, Sleepwalking into a White-Collar Bloodbath." Amati's warnings align with the frenzy across industries to replace human labor, they reported. Quote, "We talked to scores of CEOs at companies of various sizes and across many industries. Every single one of them is working furiously to figure out how and when agents or other AI technology can displace human workers at scale. The second these technologies can operate at a human efficacy level, which could be 6 months to several years from now, companies will shift from humans to machines. This could wipe out tens of millions of jobs in a very short period of time." Earlier this year, the CEO of Ford, Jim Farley, said bluntly, quote, "Artificial intelligence is going to replace literally half of white-collar workers," end quote. Doug McMillon, CEO of Walmart, the largest private employer in the country, likewise told the Wall Street Journal last month, "It's very clear that AI is going to change literally every job. Maybe there's a job in the world that AI won't change, but I haven't thought of it." McMillan announced a 3-year hiring freeze while the company works out its plans for integrating AI. Walmart has cut 70,000 jobs since 2020, with over 2 million employees. The job cutting has only begun. America's second largest private employer, Amazon, which cut 41,000 jobs between 2020 and 2025, plans to eliminate up to 600,000 more via automation in the coming years. According to the New York Times, internal company documents cite a goal of automating 75% of its operations. Other major corporations have announced similar plans. United Health Group, the world's largest health services company, is in the process of cutting 30,000 jobs and expects its AI-powered, quote, "intelligent virtual assistant system, Optum, to triage over half of its calls by the end of this year." Salesforce replaced 40,000 workers with a single AI agent this year, cutting its staff by 45%. Meta has laid off 25,000 people since 2022, and Microsoft laid off 15,000 this year alone. Intel, the recently bailed out chip and hardware manufacturer, is expected to cut up to 34,000 jobs by the end of the year, 20% of its workforce, including 15% of its factory workers. Tech workers have been first in line of fire, with 150,000 jobs cut across the sector last year. But other industries, including logistics, HR, and manufacturing, have also cited tech tools as grounds for downsizing their payrolls. Nearly 90,000 retail jobs have been cut this year, a 203% increase in layoffs since 2024. UPS is cutting 48,000 jobs this year, 10% of its global workforce. The company claims that leveraging our technology and increasing automation allowed UPS to maintain the same delivery volumes per quarter, with 3 million fewer hours of labor. They're closing 73 facilities and automating 400 others to reduce labor dependency. That means reduce you. Starbucks is axing 2,000 corporate positions and shunting 1% of its coffee shops in North America, Southwest Airlines is slashing 15% of its corporate staff. Target is cutting 8%. And JP Morgan plans to cut 10% of its operations workforce. Geico Insurance, a subsidiary of Berkshire Hathaway, announced in May that it has laid off 30,000. That same month, Nissan announced that it would shutter 7 factories and cut 20,000 jobs as a result of Trump's tariffs. Despite promises from the White House to reindustrialize the country, U.S. manufacturing has shed 89,000 jobs in the past year. The World Economic Forum reported this year that 41% of corporations globally are planning to use AI to reduce their workforce. Last month, Bernie Sanders released a report claiming that approximately 100 million U.S. jobs could be eliminated by AI within the next 10 years. The degree of AI-fueled job losses can't be exactly predicted, and adoption remains relatively low across U.S. companies. A more conservative estimate from Goldman Sachs predicts that 6 to 7% of U.S. workers, over 10 million people, could lose their jobs as a result of widespread AI adoption. So even the more optimistic reports foresee big changes. All told, across nearly 1 million workers have been laid off so far this year. While AI and automation are driving job cuts, they are just one factor among the broader economic downturn and market unpredictability. In a September survey of 1,000 business executives conducted by Resume.org, 1 in 4 said they have laid off employees this year. The same number said they plan to replace employees with AI next year, and 6 in 10 businesses plan to cut jobs next year. That means you. Among companies that have cut back on hiring, the most common reason is economic uncertainty, cited by 63%. Tariffs and trade policy concerns follow at 38%, while 35% blame declining revenue. Another 22% say investments in AI are lowering their staffing needs. The largest energy monopolies are all downsizing, citing global instability and an unpredictable future for their market. Chevron plans to cut up to 20% of global workforce, around 9,000 jobs, by the end of next year. ConocoPhillips, the third largest oil producer in the U.S., is cutting up to a quarter of its workers. BP also cut 7,700 jobs this year. ExxonMobil is cutting 2,000 jobs, around 4% of its workforce. A rationally planned economy would harness the power of tech and automation to shorten the work week for everyone, freeing up time for leisure, education, and other activities. Under capitalism, this potential turns into its opposite with the threat of mass unemployment. Increasingly, the capitalists see the dangerous consequences that could flow from this. You can't just take all these people and throw them on the street where the next job is, making $30,000 a year when they were making $150,000, said JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon. You'll have a revolution. The revolutionary communists of America are preparing for it. Class anger at the job fair. Lily M., Los Angeles, California. Tired of refreshing my email only to find rejection letters from online job applications, I went to a job fair in LA. While waiting in line under a hotel lobby's headache-inducing fluorescent lights, I chatted with 2 women in their 40s. One had recently been laid off from Microsoft, the other from Hulu. Both had worked at their respective companies for over 10 years. They'd been struggling to find work for months, going to job fairs and networking events, hoping to make an in-person connection. A young guy chimed in that online job boards are littered with ghost jobs, so companies can measure how replaceable you are. Hundreds of workers had filed inside the hotel, where only 13 companies were tabling, despite the organizers claiming there'd be over 100. One of the women had attended a job fair where out of the 20 companies present, only 2 of them were actually hiring. I made a TikTok about it because I was so pissed and it went viral, she said. Clearly, this experience is not unique. An older woman ahead of us exclaimed, "I hope this isn't an indicator of the job market." The rest of us looked at each other, wondering who was going to break the bad news. Later, I spoke to a recent grad with an engineering degree. She had just moved to LA after accepting a job offer. The day after she moved, they fired her. I had heard the stories and I had seen the numbers that point toward recession and a bad job market. But after just 45 minutes in that hotel lobby, I felt the desperation and simmering anger of our class like never before. The capitalists are attacking our ability to make a living and get by. Workers will only take so much before big class battles break out. AI data centers will make your power bill skyrocket. Average electricity bills have risen 27% in the last 5 years. Thanks to the AI data center boom, they're likely to rise even faster in the years ahead. The energy demands of these centers could more than double electricity prices by the end of the next decade, according to a report by Dominion Energy. In most of the country, households and big industries buy from the same electricity market. So when industry demands more energy, all of our prices increase. Data centers run 24/7, powering and cooling thousands of processor chips. Just 16 chips can draw 10 households worth of electricity. Elon Musk's new data center in Memphis, Tennessee, which he's naming Colossus, will run 550,000 chips. That's potentially over 340,000 homes worth of electricity, the same as the number of housing units in the whole of Washington, D.C. Bloomberg found that most areas seeing price hikes are within 50 miles of big data centers. Customers near a data center at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore pay more than double what they did in 2020. These AI factories are also using large amounts of water and spiking carbon emissions. Musk's data center can't rely on the wholesale electricity market in Memphis, Tennessee. Instead, he is using natural gas turbines to power the data center. In the poor, predominantly black neighborhood nearby, people can already smell the pollutants. Google has recorded a 48% increase in the emission of greenhouse gases since 2019, mostly due to data centers and company operations. Last year alone, Amazon's emissions increased by nearly 4 million metric tons, for a total of 68 million metric tons, up from 64 million in 2023, because of their data centers and delivery fleet. Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft, and previously a quote, tree hugger billionaire, is now urging against climate alarmism. His change of heart might have something to do with Microsoft's emissions skyrocketing by 30% since 2020 due to data center expansions. This is only the beginning. Elon Musk and Johns Hopkins haven't even finished their data centers, and many more are under construction. Data centers use around 4% of U.S. electricity in 2023. By 2028, we could see 12% or more electricity sucked away by tech billionaires. As long as this technology remains under capitalist control, it will mean job cuts, increased cost of living, and accelerated climate change. While a tiny minority profits, the rest of us will be made to bear the consequences. To fight against brain rot, fight capitalism. By Ramneet Munrai in Brooklyn, New York. As we head towards the year 2026, ChatGPT has 70 million weekly users, and the average young person will spend 25 years of their life scrolling on a screen. This technology, brought about by the largest concentration of capital humanity has ever seen, is 100% profit-driven, and nobody knows what exactly it will do to our brains in the long run. Psychologists warn that cases of AI-related psychosis are on the rise. An informal diagnosis refers to the experience of delusions and paranoia following prolonged interaction with large language model LLM chatbots. Headlines fit for Black Mirror are increasingly frequent. A 16-year-old was driven to suicide after turning to ChatGPT, initially for help with schoolwork and then for emotional support. Another describes a man driven to megalomania after spending 300 hours conversing with a chatbot, which convinced him he'd discovered a new form of math with the power to crash the internet, build force fields, levitate, and perhaps even talk to animals. OpenAI CEO Sam Altman took to X to express concern about users' increasing emotional reliance on ChatGPT. But experts reveal that the industry's deceptive design choices actually fuel such psychotic episodes. In order to increase engagement, chatbots employ AI sycophancy, or excess praise, to affirm users' beliefs, even if sacrificing truthfulness. Unsurprisingly, this taps into addictive tendencies and manipulates users for profit. But such tactics aren't unique to chatbots. For years, social media platforms have tracked our behaviors, compiled in-depth data about how to influence our decisions, and sold it to the highest advertising bidders. Instagram, X, and TikTok compete to steal our attention in the pursuit of profits. The longer we scroll, the more data they collect and the more ads they can sell. They prey on basic neurological mechanisms to maximize engagement. These companies exploit the same psychology that makes gambling addictive to keep you hooked on your phone. The pull to refresh pattern mimics pulling the lever on a slot machine to trigger dopamine. The infinite scroll patterns keeps loading content endlessly to keep you scrolling longer. The time fog pattern removes timestamps from videos, turning what seems like minutes into hours of hypnotic mindlessness. The endless loop of doom scrolling has had a devastating effect on cognition and in culture of an entire generation. Cognitive and cultural decline. A study conducted by researchers at UC Irvine found that the average attention span in 2004 was 2.5 minutes. That figure clocks in at just 47 seconds today, less than a third of what it was 2 decades ago. In the same time period, reading for pleasure has fallen by 40%. Last year, OECD reported that literacy levels are declining or stagnating in most developed countries. Math, science, and reading comprehension scores are also down globally. The most notable cognitive shift took place in the mid-2010s, when the smartphone became widely adopted in developed countries. The average person now spends 7 hours a day staring at a screen, while the average Zoomer spends 9. The 2025 Harvard Youth Poll found that less than half of young Americans feel a sense of community. In 2023, the same poll found that 6 in 10 youth find little to no purpose or meaning in their everyday lives. The screen age has ushered in an era of alienation and creative stagnation. Fashion, film, and television shows are endlessly recycled from decades past, illustrating a pervasive sentiment of cultural nostalgia. Books are becoming less complex. Songs are getting shorter, more repetitive, and their lyrics are getting simpler and convey more negative emotions. It's no surprise that the term brain rot, was Oxford's 2024 Word of the Year. What's the solution? Young people are not unaware of their condition. In 2023, Harris Poll found that 80% of Gen Z feel too dependent on technology. 60% wish they could, quote, go back to a time before everyone was plugged in. In an attempt to ditch their screens, some young people are reviving flip phones and forming Luddite clubs, a reference to the 19th century movement of British laborers who smashed machines to protest increasing automation. That's fucking awesome. The solution, however, isn't individual boycott. but collective organization. Artificial intelligence has massive potential to raise the productivity of labor on a healthy basis, but only if it is implemented under democratic workers' control. A socialist revolution will harness this technology to emancipate us from our daily drudgeries. It will be humanity's leap from the realms of necessity to the realm of freedom. Exploiting Loneliness for Profit by Erica Lowe, Brooklyn, New York. Millions of people, especially youth, are turning to AI chatbots for companionship. Character AI, which has valued at $1 billion, has 20 million users who spend more than an hour a day on average talking to its bots. The app allows users as young as 13, and its most popular bots appeal to teens, to use settings such as High School Simulator and your boy best friend who has a secret crush on you. In a study of American teenagers aged 13 to 17, 72% said they had used AI companion chatbots, with 52% chatting regularly and 13% daily. 31% of these teens said AI conversations are as or more satisfying than real life ones. Nearly 1 in 5 spend as much time with AI companions as they do with their friends or more. Last year, a 14-year-old boy who spent hours a day obsessively talking to a bot committed suicide. As for adults, 19% have chatted with AI chatbots designed to act as romantic partners. With young adults 18 to 30 twice as likely to do so than older ones. Among users, 21% they said they prefer it to a real romantic relationship. Friend AI backlash. While these bots have an expanded user base, there has also been quite a backlash. Thanks to 11,000 ads plastered all over New York City's subway stations, an AI companion called Friend has become famous. It is a necklace that listens to all your conversations and tries to participate via text. That's just a snitch. Like, it's feeding a government an ear to your everyday. You're wearing a wire all the time. The ads have slogans like "Someone who listens, responds, and supports you," and "I'll never leave dirty dishes in the sink." I'd rather have my partner's dirty dishes than be psychologically dependent on an imaginary friend that you have to pay for. Like, people used to make their own imaginary friends. This is fucking pathetic. They also leave lots of white space, which subway riders have obligingly filled with feedback. AI is not your friend. AI would not care if you lived or died. Stop profiting off loneliness. Exploit struggling people. Surveillance capitalism. Friend's 22-year-old CEO, Avi Schiffman, spent $1 million on the ads. Now he's trying to play this negative feedback as intentional. According to him, capitalism is the greatest artistic medium, but the graffiti makes it clear that growing numbers of people can tell there is something very wrong with this system. There have only been about 3,000 orders for this necklace, despite all the free speech he purchased. That's less than 1 unit per 3 ads. What's behind all this? Creativity is at the core of what it means to be human. But under this system, we have to sell our ability to create in order to enrich someone else. This alone makes work exhausting instead of energizing. On top of that, as the crisis of capitalism deepens, we have to work more for less pay, leaving us less time, energy, and money to spend on social activities. Capitalism forces a financial envelopment into all our relationships, which makes them more fraught and transactional. Parents, forced to work at exhausting jobs they hate, miss out on spending time with their children, and often end up resenting the burdens of parenthood. Dating is considered a market, and many are stuck in romantic relationships they can't leave lest they end up homeless. Even if we have the time and money, capitalism makes connecting with other people difficult. Since we are forced to sell our labor power to survive, we become the most wretched of commodities, to use Marx's words. Meanwhile, the things we create rule over us. Even before software could replace your boyfriend, capitalism turned people into things. We feel like commodities, and that creates huge pressure to see other workers the same way, which poisons virtually every human interaction. No wonder so many of us feel a crushing, intense loneliness. This is what is behind the demand for companion chatbots, but it also explains the wave of resentment against this technology. What we're seeing is really a deepening disgust for capitalism and their sick system. A widespread fight back is coming to the US on a scale the enemy has never seen. AI isn't the danger, capitalism is. Apparently, artificial intelligence is going to kill us all, at least according to Eliezer Yudkowsky and Nate Soares. Ads for their book, If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies, are plastered across the New York City subway, screeching in all caps, "We wish we were exaggerating." The author says that if super intelligent AI is created, it will have weird, strange, alien preferences that they pursue to the point of human extinction. They offer no explanation as to what those preferences might be. Their argument is based on hypotheticals and fear of uncertain future of technology. They admit it relies on limited knowledge of how AI actually works. Nonetheless, they at times allude to the real problem, the profit motive. Companies and nations are racing to make the smartest AI, regardless of the consequences. Based on what they've seen from big tech so far, most people are suspicious of the technology. Pew Research reported that 43% of adults think AI will harm them personally. The author's solution is to convince nations to ban further AI development, which is a utopian proposal. They go so far as recommending airstrikes as a means of stopping the technology if nations don't comply with the international standards they advocate. Beyond the muddle as to what might happen and how to fix it, the authors seem to miss what is right in front of us. The issue is not that one day AI might hurt people. Capitalism is already using AI to kill Gazans, replace jobs, and surveil workers. And Turkey also uses autonomous AI drones to kill human beings. Just villagers, Kurds, and also insurgents, people who are waging a revolutionary struggle against the oppressive Turkish state. We don't need to worry about sci-fi killer AI. The killer is present here and now. It's capitalism. But we're not doomed to live in a capitalist dystopia. By overthrowing capitalism, we will overthrow a terrifying future. We could reorient AI to make our lives easier with a rational plan, not based on profit, but human need. To do that, the working class needs to take democratic control of the means of production. So that's it for my meditation and reading portions. Now I'm going to get up and I'm going to do the yoga routine, which unfortunately will disturb our little guy here. And after that, we're going to do the martial arts body weight workout in the format of full body legs, upper body core exercises over and over again. Sorry, buddy, you gots to move. And I'm going to put this audiobook by Lenin back on. And we were listening to The Military Program of the Proletarian Revolution.
Russia is being increasingly Prussianized, particularly in 1907 and those countries is bound to be reactionary. The proletariat must not only oppose all such wars, but must also wish for the defeat of its, quote, own government in such wars, and utilize its defeat for revolutionary insurrection, if an insurrection to prevent the war proves unsuccessful. On the question of a militia, we should say we are not in favor of a bourgeois militia. We are in favor only of a proletarian militia. Therefore, not a penny, not a man. Not only for a standing army, but even for a bourgeois militia. Even in countries like the United States or Switzerland, Norway, etc. Let me read that again. even for a bourgeois militia, even in countries like the United States, when people try to do the boogaloo thing or whatever, these are right-wing bourgeois militias. Okay. The more so that in the freest Republican countries, e.g. Switzerland, we see that the militia is being increasingly Prussianized, particularly in 1907 and 1911, and prostituted by being used against strikers. We can demand popular elections of officers, abolition of all military law, equal rights for foreign and native-born workers, a point particularly important for those imperialist states which, like Switzerland, are more and more blatantly exploiting larger numbers of foreign workers while denying them all rights. Comment also, obviously, the United States today, well, and really throughout its history. Further, we can demand the right of every 100, say, inhabitants of a given country to form voluntary military training associations with free election of instructors paid by the state, etc. Only under these conditions could the proletariat acquire military training for itself and not for its slave owners. And the need for such training is imperatively dictated by the interests of the proletariat. The Russian Revolution showed that every success of the revolutionary movement, even a partial success like the seizure of a certain city, a certain factory town, or winning over a certain section of the army, inevitably compels the victorious proletariat to carry out just such a program. Lastly, it stands to reason that opportunism can never be defeated by mere programs. It can only be defeated by deeds. The greatest and fatal error of the bankrupt Second International was that its words did not correspond to its deeds, that it cultivated the habit of hypocritical and unscrupulous revolutionary phrase-mongering. Note the present attitude of Kautsky and Co. toward the Basel Manifesto. Disarmament as a social idea, i.e., an idea that springs from and can affect a certain social environment, and is not the invention of some crackpot, springs evidently from the peculiar, quote, tranquil conditions prevailing, by way of exception, in certain small states, which have for a fairly long time stood aside from the world's path of war and bloodshed, and hope to remain in that way. To be convinced of this, we have only to consider the arguments advanced, for instance, by the Norwegian advocates of disarmament. We're a small country, they say. Our army is small. There's nothing we can do against the great powers, and consequently nothing we can do to resist forcible involvement in an imperialist alliance with one or the other great power group. We want to be left in peace in our backwoods and continue our backwoods politics, demand disarmament, compulsory arbitration, permanent neutrality, etc. Lenin adds, permanent after the Belgian fashion, no doubt. Comment there. So when Lenin is talking about these different groups of the great powers, think of the factions in World War I and then World War II. You have the older imperialist, colonial, capitalist powers like the UK and France versus the upstarts like Germany. This is basically what he's talking about. Different factions of imperialists vying for control of who is going to exploit and dominate the world. The petty striving of petty states to hold aloof, the petty bourgeois desire to keep as far away as possible from the great battles of world history, to take advantage of one's relatively monopolistic position in order to remain in hidebound passivity. This is the objective social environment which may ensure the disarmament idea a certain degree of success and a certain degree of popularity in some small states. That striving is, of course, reactionary and is based entirely on illusions, for in one way or another, imperialism draws the small states into the vortex of world economy and world politics. In Switzerland, for example, the imperialist environment objectively prescribes two courses to the labor movement. The opportunists, in alliance with the bourgeoisie, are seeking to turn the country into a Republican democratic monopolistic federation that would thrive on profits from imperialist bourgeois tourists, and to make this, quote, tranquil monopolistic position as profitable and as tranquil as possible. The genuine Swiss social democrats are striving to use Switzerland's relative freedom and her, quote, international position to help the victory of the close alliance of the revolutionary elements in the European workers' parties. Switzerland, then God, does not have a separate language of her own, but uses three world languages, the 3 languages spoken in the adjacent belligerent countries. If 20,000 Swiss party members were to pay a weekly levy of 2 centimes as a sort of extra war tax, we would have 20,000 francs per annum, a sum more than sufficient periodically to publish in 3 languages and distribute among the workers and soldiers of the belligerent countries, in spite of the bans imposed by the general staffs, all the truthful evidence about the incipient revolt of the workers, their fraternizing in the trenches, their hope that the weapons will be used for revolutionary struggle against the imperialist bourgeoisie of their, quote, own countries, etc. That is not new. It is being done by the best papers, like La Sentinelle, Volksrecht, and the Berner Tagwacht, although unfortunately on an inadequate scale. There's a quick footnote there. La Sentinelle was a newspaper, organ of the Swiss Social Democratic Organization of Neuchâtel Canton, Switzerland, published at La Chaux de Fonds from 1890 to 1906 and resumed in 1910. During the First World War, it followed an internationalist policy. Volksrecht, or the People's Right, was a daily paper, organ of the Swiss Social Democratic Party, founded in Zurich in 1898. During the First World War, it published articles by left Zimmerwaldists. Finally, the Berner Tagwacht, or the Bern Guardian, was a social democratic paper founded in Bern in 1893. It published articles by Karl Liebknecht, Franz Mehring, and other social democrats in the early days of the First World War. In 1917, it came out in open support of the social chauvinists. Back to the main text. Only through such activity can the splendid decision of the Aarau Party Congress become something more than a splendid decision. Footnote, the Aarau Congress of the Swiss Social Democratic Party met on November 20 to 21, 1915. The central issue was the party's attitude towards the Zimmerwald internationalist groups, and the struggle developed between the 3 following trends. 1. Anti-Zimmerwaldists. 2. Supporters of the Zimmerwald right, and 3. Supporters of the Zimmerwald left. Robert Grimm tabled a resolution urging the party to affiliate with the Zimmerwald group and endorse the political program of the Zimmerwald right. The left forces, in an amendment moved by the Lausanne branch, called for mass revolutionary struggle against the war, declaring that only a victorious proletarian revolution could actually put an end to the imperialist war. Under Grimm's pressure, the amendment was withdrawn, but it was again proposed by M.M. Karatnov, a Bolshevik with the right to vote delegated by one of the party's branches. Out of tactical considerations, Grimm and his supporters were obliged to approve the amendment, and it was carried by 258 votes to 141. Back to the main text. The question that interests us now is, does the disarmament demand correspond to this revolutionary trend among the Swiss Social Democrats? It obviously does not. Objectively, disarmament is an extremely national, a specifically national program of small states. It is certainly not the international program of international revolutionary social democracy. Comment, of course, when Lenin says social democracy at this stage, this is a reference to all Marxism, both including what we would call today social democracy, welfare capitalism, opportunism, and also what we would call today communism. And that's the end of the audiobook. So that was the military program of the proletarian revolution. What do you think? To me, Lenin seems to have devoted so much thought and tons of ink to these particular questions. I mean, he was writing and arguing furiously against this split, not against the split, but against the opportunists who were splitting off. And I mean, it was that kind of really timely maneuvering that he did that, to me, is one of the reasons why the Bolsheviks were positioned to have the October Revolution and outmaneuver all the other factions of former social democracy, or the former Marxist movement. A lot of people denounce Lenin for one reason or another. The fact is, if you look at what was going on in the socialist movement, the Socialist International at that time, the Second International, I don't see how you can, from a 21st century perspective, really which is, we study this history and this theory so that we can solve political problems of today. So living in the 21st century today, trying to solve the problems that are in front of us, I don't know how you can look back and say that he was wrong on any of these questions. I mean, to me, it's just indefensible. But there's still people taking these kinds of positions today. I referenced Vosh as kind of a modern day slacker Kautsky, if you will. So, I mean, this dialogue goes on, and I think it's just up to those of us who do the reading, much unlike a Vosh and his followers, to keep doing the education, the agitation, and the organization. And, you know, I use the hashtag Revolution 2030 because I believe that if we start now, by 2030, we can have boosted our numbers and our organization to a point where, you know, we can actually have a real moment, you know, no more just Bernie Sanders, no more libertarianism like all these other kind of pseudo-radical traditions. We need to take this the distance and end capitalism. So anyway, what do you think? Leave a comment below and we'll continue the discussion in the comment section as always. In the meantime, thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month. Every donation is very encouraging and much appreciated. We currently, as of this time recording, have 76 patrons who have signed up to contribute. That's tremendous, that's amazing, and that number has only been growing, so hats off to you. I'm glad people are taking this stuff seriously to the point where they're willing to financially support me to continue to produce this. I do believe that we have some really pressing political problems to be solved, and I do think that these readings and these commentary, I mean, from the feedback I'm getting, as well as, you know, the thought in my head, is that this has some actual value for moving things along. Obviously, I'm not an island. I'm just one person, one channel, doing this among many. But anyway, thanks for your support and your belief. I also sincerely think that this is a useful thing to do, so it's really nice to connect with other people who think and feel the same way. If you'd like to help out without making a donation, liking, subscribing, leaving a comment, even if it's just thanks or good video, all that helps to boost the channel, as well as sharing it on your social media, particularly if you're on Facebook, where currently I have no presence. But ultimately, whatever you do in support of socialism, thanks for doing it, whether it has anything to do with this channel or not. Join an organization if there's a good one in your area, or start a project if you've got an idea and the comrades and resources to help you get it off the ground. And we'll catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded.
Before we continue, I'm going to put on another playlist.
Would have been overthrown the second it came into existence. How many of you read Capital all the way through, understood the inner workings of capitalism, Marxist economics, and then was like, on that basis, I need to join a party? Okay, maybe one. We got Chris. All right. No, I think like me, most of us likely, joined because we experienced the absurdity and cruelty of this system and all its horrific manifestations. And maybe like me, you thought that understanding economics might be unnecessary. I mean, just look around. It's so clear how rotten this system is. The wealthiest 1% of Americans own a third of all the wealth, while the bottom 50% own only 4%. Almost 8 out of 10 Americans live paycheck to paycheck. The same percentage are in debt. And 1 in 4 workers is either completely unemployed or effectively unemployed, only able to find part-time work, gig stuff. 771,000 Americans are homeless, while 15 million homes sit vacant. Hunger affects 1 in 7 American households, while 40% of the food supply goes to waste every year in this country. All of this in the richest country in the history of the world, right? It's clear this is absurd. It's completely ridiculous. And we're told that this is the best of all possible worlds that we could possibly have. This is what we got. And we know in our gut that this isn't true. But if we don't have a scientific understanding of capitalism, of the system, we can't change that fact. If anger alone was enough, capitalism would have been overthrown the second it came into existence. Class society might have never even come about because clearly it just rests on such immiseration of the masses. Reformists think that they can do away with these different features that I've outlined, but keep the system itself in place. They have a kind of moralistic view of capitalism. They think that they can substitute bad, greedy, nasty bosses and politicians for nicer ones that will just do things differently, institute different policies and so forth. But we have to understand the inner workings, development, and contradictions of capitalism so that we can understand that we cannot tweak the system to address these symptoms. And this is why we're revolutionaries, not just because we want, super hardcore, we like violence, anything like that. It's because there's no other way. Reformists in power inherit the same crisis-ridden system that the right-wing and more reactionary forces are overseeing right now, and they're forced to manage capitalism in decline. But we understand that crises are not aberrations, but systemic to capitalism. Now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, liberals like Francis Fukuyama proclaimed the end of history. Capitalism had triumphed over the planned economy of the Soviet Union, and once and for all had shown that liberal democracy, capitalist democracy, was the only path forward for humanity. But since then, we've seen 2008, 2020, endless wars in the Middle East and elsewhere, inequality growing sharper, global debt weighing down the economy. The crisis of capitalism has not been resolved despite what these liberals thought. And even many bourgeois now, if you read the capitalist press, are clutching their pearls, seeking ways to stave off the crisis and the revolutions that their system brings. So what is capitalism? Is it an idea? Is it an ideal? Is it a set of rules and regulations laid out by governments? Or is it just the expression of human nature, which is greedy and self-interested? I would say no, but Marx described it as one of the main modes of production in the development of human history. The way in which a given society produces and distributes the goods and services society needs, or as is more often the case, not producing and distributing what people and society actually need. And it has not always existed. We have to be really clear, right? It's only been around for a couple hundred years. Long before this, we talked yesterday during the women's liberation discussion about primitive communism, where there was no surplus for a ruling class to rise above society and live off the labor of others. We had slave society and feudal society that were organized in completely different ways. And each of these had a logic of their own, which is distinct and must be understood in their historical context and specificity. But this does not mean that they are not interconnected, that one didn't flow from the other and was determined by one another. This is a really important thing as we have a dialectical materialist understanding of the development of history. So what is the logic of the capitalist system? This is the question I want to try to answer today. Well, it's a highly complex and chaotic system with many moving parts and processes. But if we strip everything back, we see that individuals produce commodities for exchange in order to acquire other commodities that we need to live. So the commodity is the atom of the capitalist organism. It's not something you make that you then happen to exchange, but something you make solely for the sake of being exchanged for something else. If I make myself a sweater, that's not a commodity. But if I make one for sale, I've produced a commodity. And Marx describes capitalism as generalized commodity production and exchange. Everyone must exchange their commodities for other commodities that they need. Virtually everything we require in society, we have to get through an exchange on the market. There's no self-sufficiency, and maybe a few people can make it off the grid or whatever, but it's going to be with tools that were produced by society, things that they learned by society itself. So we really created a really socialized production. So what is this commodity? The commodity has a dual nature, as Marx describes it. On the one hand, it has a use value. This is its natural qualities that make it useful to any given individual. And where that's determined, because right-wing reactionaries will be like, oh, well, if someone just wanted a mud pie, does that, make it, useful and so forth. The determination of usefulness is only can it be sold on the market. So things that are unhealthy or bad for us or these kinds of things, if they can find a buyer on the market, they therefore have a use value. They're useful to someone. On the other hand, a commodity has an exchange value. And this has nothing to do with the natural, concrete qualities of the product that is the commodity, but in fact, it's a social relationship with other commodities. And essentially, it's how much of another commodity can I exchange for mine. It is a quantitative relationship, a ratio which commodities can be exchanged for one another. And this quantitative relationship between commodities themselves actually hides behind it a relationship between the producers who made this commodity and the amount of labor that they've put into their commodities. If we ignore the use value of these different commodities being exchanged, then the only common property that they have to be compared to, and it's clear, Marx wasn't starting from some theoretical basis of like, oh, this is how commodities are going to be exchanged for one another. He just saw commodities of completely different kinds with completely different use values were able to be exchanged for one another. So what was the basis of this exchange that someone could say, my commodity is worth the amount of your commodity that we're exchanging? And if you ignore the use value, then you see that the only common property that they have to be compared with one another against is that they are products of human labor. A certain amount of one commodity will be equal to another commodity because the amount of human labor is equal in each. So if we've ignored the natural qualities which make the use value of a commodity, we also have to ignore the different useful kinds of labor that goes into the commodity. We look at the labor time that a worker took to produce the commodity, and this forms its exchange value, or its value. If two workers produce the same commodity, but one takes twice as long as the other, does that commodity that took twice as long have twice the exchange value? No. We look at the average socially necessary labor time to produce this commodity. And this is very, historically contingent. It depends sometimes by region, by country, but definitely by historical development of what we call the means of production, the technology, the machinery, and the technique. For instance, Marx talks about in Capital, when the power loom was introduced, replacing the hand loom, all of a sudden the amount of labor time that was socially necessary to produce was cut in half, and therefore its value was cut in half. Its exchange value was now cut in half. But if you were still producing with a hand loom, you couldn't go onto the market and say, well, I took twice as long, so you got to give me, twice, I have twice as much value here. They say, no, I'm just going to buy the one that was produced by the power loom. So Lily and I have recently moved up from San Diego, and we've unfortunately had to spend a lot of time at IKEA. And and when you're walking around IKEA, I don't see on all the different furniture like 1 week, 3 years, 1 day, and all the labor times that it took these things. No, of course we see prices, right? Price is exchange value expressed in money. And I like to think of the relationship between the price of a commodity and its exchange value as that between an anchor and a buoy. The exchange value is kind of like the anchor at any given time. But then if you have a buoy that's tethered to that anchor, with all the currents, the winds, and so forth, that buoy can fluctuate around where that anchor is. And this is the fluctuations of supply and demand that push price around its actual cost of production, and another way of saying socially necessary labor time. So what is this money that exchange value has to express itself in order to be realized? Well, money, like capitalism, did not always exist. Earlier modes of production were not predominantly based on exchanging goods internally. But as more surplus inside grows, it allows merchants to trade externally between different tribes and communities and societies and cities and so forth. And this then seeps into and erodes this kind of planned and communal style of producing in common and then rationing it out based on whether it was a bureaucracy, a priestly caste, or in earlier forms, much smaller tribal societies, some kind of council of elders or women or something like this. But as merchants are acquiring this surplus and trading between, that brings private ownership of production into these societies themselves. So money comes about as a universal yardstick to measure the value of all these commodities. It is the ideal expression of value for the concrete labor times of commodities, and it's a means of exchange. Everything can be exchanged for it, and it can be exchanged for everything else. It's something that, if you're, out traveling very far distances, you can't bring along just everything you own, like your cattle and maybe you have some sweaters and stuff like that. You need to be able to just exchange something that everyone also wants and can therefore then, when they bring it back, can be exchanged for everything else. So money, for that reason, begins as a commodity like all others. Gold and silver become the best commodities for money because of their ability to hold value. They don't depreciate very easily. They have high values in small quantities due to their rarity and so forth, and they can be easily transported. So they become the most widely accepted universal equivalent, this measure of value for the exchange of commodities. But eventually, as we know, money becomes mere banknotes and digital currency, which don't have a lot of value, if any at all, in themselves like gold and silver do, but are merely a token of value. It's a claim to a certain amount of the exchange value embodied in the wealth of society. And this change allowed the function of money as a means of credit to expand, extending the money supply beyond the current amount of value in commodities in society. So it allows production to expand beyond its limits of the market and speculate on future profits more easily, which has obviously become a staple in world capitalism today. But as it fluctuates away from the real amount of value in commodities in society, you get the menace of inflation, something we're all very familiar with. And this is essentially more money chasing fewer goods. This detachment of the money supply as an equivalent, as a representation of how much value is actually in society. And more money without more value in the form of commodities doesn't increase the actual value in society. Printing more money doesn't actually create more commodities that have actual value in society. And each dollar represents a smaller portion of the total value in society. So if the capitalists keep their prices the same, they receive less value in the form of the same amount of money as before, and therefore it eats away at the profits of the capitalists. So what do? They raise their prices, right? But then what do workers need to do, right? Now we're getting the same amount of money, and now we can't buy back as many of the commodities as we used to, and the purchasing power erodes. But if we're able to fight for higher wages, and if the capitalists concede to that, then the capitalists have to hike their prices up even further. And this is what the bourgeois economists call as the wage price spiral. They blame workers. They say, the workers needed higher wages, so I got to raise my price. But really, it's just the workers are having to catch up and to maintain their living standards. And so workers are not to blame. Now it can also happen, I've described it as an increase in the money supply, that's what causes inflation. It can also happen where the money supply remains the same, but there are shortages of commodities, so their price goes up. Say it's gas, right, a crucial commodity for all forms of production and consumption that other capitalists rely on. They have to pay more for that gas, and they therefore incorporate it into their cost of production and the price of their commodities. And this is how you can have a more generalized, expanding inflation that seeps into the whole economy. So let's return to the question of value here. The bourgeois economists that preceded Marx, people like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, that Marx, stood on the shoulders of, right, and saw himself as developing further, going to the logical conclusion of what they were trying to get at. Because unlike the bourgeois economists of today, these figures were genuinely trying to scientifically understand the capitalist economy, but they got hung up. They did put forward a labor theory of value, which is what I've been describing, is that labor is the source of value. But they couldn't explain what Marx called the enigma of profit. The bourgeois economists thought essentially it was just buying near and selling dear. That is to say, profit is found in the process of exchange, not in the process of production. But under capitalism, each capitalist is both a buyer and a seller of commodities. They buy the raw materials and they hire workers and so forth, and then they sell commodities. So if you're scamming on the one end, just like jacking up the price a little bit, well then everyone else is going to do the same, and it would just kind of equalize. So Marx said this can't be the source of where profit comes from. And Marx discovered the roots of where profit came from, and that's why he's hated. Bourgeois economists today, they maybe nod to Smith and Ricardo, but they reject the labor theory of value because Marx showed what it actually explained about capitalism as a parasitic system, as we'll get into. So the crux of the thing is that Marx said commodities are on average sold at their cost of production, the socially necessary labor time to produce them, and yet the bourgeois make profits. How can this be? The bourgeois economists thought that when a capitalist hires a worker, that they're buying the worker's labor. But this is wrong. But for a sec, let's pretend that it is true. So I used to work for this guy doing landscaping, and I was provided the tools I needed. And then I spent 8 hours a day working, say for a month on a particular job site. So say that the PVC for the irrigation, the wear and tear of the shovels, the cutters, the jackhammer, the plant material, and the mulch cost my boss $5,000 for the month for me to use them. I then took those tools and raw materials, which simply transfer their existing value into the commodity that they produce. And I transformed all of this into a new garden, which the client will pay $15,000. If it is the case that my boss bought my labor, then clearly I should have been paid $10,000, right? Well, I can tell you that was definitely not the case. But if it were, then clearly my boss would just be breaking even. There'd be no profit. Not only would there be nothing for him to put in his pockets, but there would be no reinvestment. There'd be no expanding the business with new work crews, larger scale projects, and so forth. But as a matter of fact, right, my boss did make a profit, and I was not paid $10,000. And this is because in reality, he did not buy my labor, but my labor power. This is the human capacity to work, right? It's not the work itself. It's our ability to work for a given amount of time. And it's this special commodity because unlike in any other mode of production, it's the first time it's commodified under capitalism, and it puts out more than it needs to take in. The use value of the labor power is the labor itself, the labor that it can perform, right? But its exchange value, its cost of production, is less than the value it can produce as a use value. And this contradiction between the use value of labor and the exchange value of labor power is the basis of profit and the inequality between the capitalist and the worker. So if labor power is a commodity, my ability to work, then, like I said, it has an exchange value as a socially necessary labor time. This is the groceries, the rent. Maybe you need a smartphone today. Pretty much everyone needs one in order to work, communicate with your boss, and have them track you and all that kind of stuff. And maybe you need a car. Definitely if you're in LA, you probably need to afford a car and you need to afford gas. But you also, it's not just the day-to-day things, but also the education and the training that created the kind of labor that you're able to provide for the capitalist. And these are all generally reflected in the price of your labor power, which we call a wage. And again, we can return to this anchor in the buoy. The price of labor power is fluctuating above or below, oftentimes below, the exchange value of labor power. And workers must fight to keep it up so they can afford to continue living. But we have to be clear, it's the average amount of wages to reproduce the working class so they can come back and work another day for the capitalists. So even if certain workers are falling off, as long as in general the working class is able to survive, this will kind of set that limit. But it's a question of the class struggle here too, right? It's not just some fixed law workers fight to keep it up and to push it up higher and higher, taking more of the value that they produce. So the working day is divided into two parts. There's the necessary labor time and the surplus labor time that goes into the working day. So the necessary labor time is that amount of time that you work producing value for your boss that then covers your wage. If you're highly productive, if your boss is good at exploiting you, as we're getting into, you'll work very quickly to make back that wage. And then the rest of the time you're working, right? If they say, oh, I'll give you, $20 an hour, and then you produce $20 an hour, you don't get to just go home and say, okay, well, I've made it back. No, they hired you for 8 hours, 10 hours, whatever it is. And so they're going to squeeze you for all of those 8 hours, even if you've already covered, your wages necessary. And the difference between the necessary and the surplus labor time is what we call the rate of exploitation. I think oftentimes people talk about exploitation as if it's just like, oh, your boss is really mean, like you're like really exploited and they're just really aggressive or something like this. But actually, it's just this ratio between the necessary time and the surplus time. And so the boss wants to make your labor power as cheap as possible in order to reduce the amount of time that you're working just to reproduce your wages, which they're going to pay you back in the next day or the next week or whatever. But during the surplus labor time, what the worker produces is not just value, but surplus value, right? This is the value above and beyond what it takes to pay yourself back. And this is the source of profit for the capitalists. And so in order to increase their profit, they maximize the surplus labor time and minimize the socially necessary labor time to produce the worker. And this is what allows capitalism to grow and expand historically. It urges them to get better machinery and then take that surplus or a portion of it, plow it back into production, and therefore increase productivity and lower the cost of production for their commodities so they can outcompete their rivals. Marx didn't title his most famous work Commodities or Price or Value. He titled it Capital. So remember I said if I produce a sweater for myself, it's not a commodity. But if I produce it for sale, then it is. Well, if I took that money that I got for the sale of that sweater and I opened up a sweater factory, now the money I get from the sales and the initial money I got from that sale and the machines and the labor power that I buy to produce the sweaters are capital, and I am a capitalist. Don't clip that thing. If I took the money from the sale and went on vacation rather than in reinvesting in production, then that's no longer capital, right? And there's this thing Marx talks about that there can be capital in potential, right? Money sitting in a bank used for investments is likely, put aside for the sake of reinvesting in production. But until it's actually in production, hiring workers, paying for machines, and in that process, that labor process, the production process itself, transforms it all into capital. Capital is value which is used to produce new surplus value by exploiting labor power, the labor power of the workers that it hires. It does consist of the tools, the land, factories, money needed to produce commodities, but only if the working class is hired to use them to produce new surplus value through the exploitation of their labor power. Marx described capital as the dead labor of the previous workers that had poured their labor into these machines, into extracting the raw materials, into creating the buildings and so forth. And it sucks the living labor of the workers' labor power that is hired to increase the value of the capital of the dead labor. And so he talks about it like vampire-like. Capital is sucking the living labor from the working class. And the end result of all of this is that there is more value than the capitalists started with, and this is the whole point for them. The whole point of capitalism is not to produce commodities. It's not to definitely do anything that society actually needs. The point is to produce surplus value, increase surplus value. But it doesn't stop here. If new surplus value is created in production, if the commodities containing this value go unsold, then that surplus value is not realized and you'll go out of business. So surplus value is created in production, but it has to be realized to the capitalist in exchange. And because there are other capitalists producing the same commodities, the capitalist has to produce as much as possible, as cheaply as possible. If my boss had picked some arbitrary price way exceeding the exchange value, the cost of production of producing that garden, then someone else surely would come by and along and say, hey, I'll do it for way cheaper because that's how much it actually cost me to do it, and clearly my boss would be kicked off the contract. Now, this changes a bit with monopolies and cornering markets and so forth, but you know, looking at the essential logic, this is what drives the price closer to its actual cost of production. So competition between capitalists regulates that relationship between price and exchange value. Capital also therefore flows into the industry and into investments that give the highest rate of profit. But as other capitalists discover the same thing, they have to compete with one another, and they drive down the cost. So maybe there's some new industry that a capitalist breaks into, a new machine that they use that allows them to produce way more and way more cheaply, but they still can make so much because the average price is about the same. They're going to make super profits. But then, you know, people, especially nowadays, you know, people catch on and they say, well, I want to get into that business. And all this capital, you know, the banks get used for this, pours in and funnels into this industry, and they're forced to then lower their price in order to compete with these new capitalists that are in the game. And this drives the price closer to its cost of production. But it's not just workers struggling with their bosses for a greater share of the surplus value they create, but also capitalists competing with each other for the total profit in society. And it's not just between capitalists in the same industry as I've just described, but also between the industrialist, the landlord, the bankers. Each wants to take the biggest cut of the new value that's being created for themselves. I've heard sometimes you maybe hear, like, you know, a certain capitalist might be sympathetic to the workers saying, we need lower rent. But he's not sympathetic to, you know, the living standards of the workers. He would just love it if it was cheaper for his workers to live near the factory, and therefore he can pay them less because it doesn't cost as much for them to live there. I like this quote from Capital. Marx writes that competition subordinates every individual capitalist to the immanent laws of capitalist production as external and coercive laws. It compels him to keep extending his capital so as to preserve it, and he can only extend it by means of progressive accumulation. Or as the former Citibank chief executive Chuck Prince put it in 2007, that as long as the music is playing, you gotta get up and dance. If the capitalists stop exploiting, they cease to be a capitalist and someone else takes their place. Marx describes the capitalist as this personification of capital, this just meat suit driven by external laws, pushing them to have to continue to reinvest and lower their cost of production despite what they personally want. And this produces an anarchy on the market as each individual owner, each individual capitalist fights for their own individual company's position on the market and share of the consumer's money that they're paying for these commodities, not what society actually needs. And so following this drive to accumulate more and more capital for accumulation's sake to outcompete rivals, we get the fundamental cause of capitalist crisis, the crisis of overproduction. This is the, I think, clearest expression of the contradiction between the productive capacity of society, the means of production, in contradiction with the property relations, the private ownership of these things prevailing, whereby the expansion of use values that society needs is stopped, it's halted because individuals own them and they only produce them if they can be sold for a profit. I like to think of the image of like a grown man wearing children's clothes he was given as a child, right? The growth of the content is far outstripping the form of the property relations. And because it's the unpaid labor of the working class which produces this abundance of goods and services in the first place, the exploitation of the labor power, the lowering of the necessary labor time, the increasing of the surplus labor time, the working class is never, as a whole, will never be able to buy back all of the commodities that they produce because they're not paid the full value of what they produce. So competition forces capitalists to continue producing as cheaply as possible, but they produce so cheaply, and competition has driven the price down to such an extent to the cost of production, sometimes even below the cost of production, and there's so much on the market, so many commodities, they can't sell enough of their goods and services, and thus stop production. And this is when the crisis strikes. When the crisis hits, they lay off a bunch of their workforce, cut down supply to try and keep their profit margins up and better match the low demand that their own system has created. But it only deepens the crisis because now there's even less workers receiving wages to buy back the goods. And with each crisis, big companies eat up the small that can't weather the storm. The law of competition turns into its opposite and gives rise to monopolies. The very force that was supposed to be something that allowed anyone to get into the market and compete has now turned into something that stops competition. Not completely, of course, but it puts brakes on it, puts limits on it. Capital is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, and it's also centralized. So I think Joe was talking about last night vertically integrated supply chains, and this means that instead of having to buy from each capitalist on the supply chain, if you just own the whole thing or have like exclusive rights to deals with them, then you'll get to absorb much more of the profit that comes from production. And when the crisis hits, as they say, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. So just 500 US companies make up 2/3 of US GDP, and they employ 20% of American workers. And many more businesses and their workers are directly tied to the functioning of these 500 firms. As the crisis of overproduction strikes, the ruling class is forced to step in and use credit to get the system going again by allowing workers and companies to consume more of the overproduced goods they couldn't afford before. The money supply is increased beyond the actual value in society in order to try and galvanize the economy again. But this only, this influx of credit, this only sets the stage for larger and deeper crises in the future. They're really just kicking the can down the road, because with credit comes debt. This dialectical unity of these two things. National, household, and corporate debt rises. As it stands today, most advanced capitalist states have debt to GDP ratios of over 100%. In the US, credit card delinquencies, not being able to pay back your credit card debt, are reaching the same levels they did in 2007 before the housing crisis. Delinquencies on subprime auto loan payments are at record highs today, and corporate debt levels are also staggering. We talked about the zombie companies, right? And the thing with debt is that it must be repaid, or else the lenders stop lending and stop propping up the system. So more and more of the capitalist profits have to go to paying interest on this debt, and less goes to reinvesting in production, creating more jobs, and lowering the cost of goods and services. And in order to counteract this depression on their profits, the capitalists and their state attack workers' pay. They attack their benefits, healthcare subsidies, and so forth. This is what we're seeing with Trump's big, beautiful bill. And clearly, they had, as Elon Musk put it, but they haven't gone far enough, right? They still have this mountain of debt. 2008 was the greatest crisis of capitalism since the Great Depression. It was an organic crisis of capitalism, not just a result of the regular boom and bust cycle of capitalism, but a result of capitalism having nowhere productive to go but to gamble and speculate. There was mass overproduction in homes, which was sustained by banks offering these 0% down, 0% interest until 2 years when the interest rates spike, giving them to people that they knew were not in a position to be able to pay these mortgage payments. And after a certain period, when the real interest rates kicked in, but the banks created these financial instruments, the CDOs and all these kinds of things that I'm not going to get too into right now, but it allowed them to hide the bad debt in with the good, and they themselves didn't really know what they were holding as far as this debt not being able to be repaid. But as long as they kept the debt machine going, with more credit being extended and people using it to buy homes, increasing the price of the homes with each foreclosure, with more credit being extended, the banks were able to get filthy rich for a time. But eventually, enough people were defaulting on their mortgages, and the banks realized the pile of valueless debt that they were holding that no one could pay back, and everything collapsed. They stopped lending to one another and so forth. So when the crash happened, the banks were bailed out with piles of cash from the government. Banks were effectively given money through quantitative easing from the Federal Reserve. But the workers who had lost their savings in the banks and their pensions and so forth, defaulted on their mortgages, were totally left out to dry. The bankers took these handouts, and rather than investing in new production and creating jobs again, they gave themselves big bonuses and gambled on the stock market. The cost of borrowing money, the interest rates set by the Federal Reserve, were kept incredibly low to try and get the productive economy moving again. But this only fed more into the speculative casinos of Wall Street rather than a new boom time economy. Average GDP growth was 1% between 2008 and 2020. For comparison, China's growth rate in this period was 8%. On average. When the pandemic hit in 2020, the ruling class was forced to shutter all but the most essential services in production, and firing or furloughing workers, keeping them part-time, paying them less. And in order to keep the system alive so that companies could still sell their goods on the market, the ruling class had to dole out stimulus checks, right? Unemployment to workers and companies alike. So this was, again, right, we go back to inflation. New money without new value in production, not just no new value, but like a drying up of the value. We saw lots of shortages and so forth. And as we emerged from the pandemic, we therefore saw a huge surge in generalized inflation, where all industries were raising their prices. This was then compounded by gas and oil shortages due to the Ukraine war and cutting off Europe from Russian gas. This increased it, fueled it even more. And in order to combat this inflation, the Federal Reserve was forced to raise the interest rates on new loans to make borrowing money more expensive. So all these firms that were dependent, from 2008 onwards on these really cheap credit, these low interest rates, they had taken on massive amounts of debt that wasn't that expensive to pay off because the interest payments were relatively low. They now had to spend much more to service these debts. And both 2008 and the aftermath of the pandemic have created the conditions of today. They are crises that have exposed that capitalism has nowhere productive to go. So before 2008, going back to the 1970s and again in the 1990s and up until today, capitalist production has flowed out of the US to move closer to raw materials, supply chains, and of course cheaper labor. The reinvestment of profits in production, which was the basis of capitalism's progressive period, has declined year after year, especially since the 1970s. Forbes noted that reinvestment in the means of production for non-financial firms made up just 10% of US GDP at the end of 2023. They explained that big business is, quote, not leading an investment boom across the economy, even as the country faces massive challenges in the areas of climate change, artificial intelligence, and population aging. Now Trump thinks he's going to bring back a golden age of American manufacturing and a renaissance, all this, but he's going to have to compete with a much cheaper and more abundant labor and resources in China. They're already having to drive down their own cost of productions and automate away and so forth. So this is the reality, right? There's this post-2008 reality of 1% growth, of really fickle job markets and these kinds of things that we've been discussing this whole weekend. This is the reality we've grown up in. The bourgeois see an increasingly angry working class who has seen millions and millions of decent paying union manufacturing jobs go abroad so that the capitalists can realize a greater rate of profit by moving production to cheaper conditions. NAFTA is often talked about as kind of this like defining moment where this really accelerated. But this was not some random decision. They were following the iron logic of the capitalist system, which demands growing profits, and they had to find a way to achieve that. And in pursuit of these profits, the capitalists increase their exploitation of the working class, drive down their standards of living, all the while automating away their jobs to try to sell more commodities for cheaper. Like I said, this was the basis of the development of technology, and labor-saving techniques in production. Historically, it was much cheaper to get a machine and hire fewer workers, but this process has in many cases reached its limits. In many industries, the cost of production of the worker has been driven so low that it's cheaper to hire workers than buy an expensive, cutting-edge machine. Automation under capitalism is not about reducing the time humanity must spend working, but about cheapening the cost of production and increasing the productivity of labor to outcompete rival capitalists. Only socialism and a planned economy can take that technology and put it to its actual use of saving humanity from the drudgery and work that we all deplore, and allowing like our labor, our creative capacities to be used to things that we actually want to do. We have all of these unemployed and underemployed workers under capitalism who capitalism cannot make use of productively, profitably on the one hand, and then we have a bunch of overworked workers on the other hand who are having to work 50, 60, 70, 80-hour work weeks. Not because there's no infrastructure to repair, no machines to implement, which could save us from having to work so much, but again, because they cannot make a profit. So we know that all things have a beginning, a period of development, and eventually a decline and decay, right? We're dialecticians. Change is at the root of all. Everything is a complex web of contradictions which drive it to develop at first, but then lead it into stagnation by those same laws themselves. Without this method of dialectical materialism, the bourgeois economists, the reformists alike, they think crises are merely the result of accidents, of fumbling of policy choice, of narrow national interests, which really get in the way of capitalism working the way it's supposed to. But it is precisely these crises which allow it to operate at all, destroying the overproduction and allowing a new upswing. But eventually, right, this runs out of room to grow and starts turning in circles. The snake begins to eat its own tail, and a new upswing is totally out of the question. We understand the development of capitalism also as a part of the development of history. It's not this isolated thing. We can see that the embryo of a new society has developed in the womb of this old decrepit system. Socialism and communism are not built by clearing the decks and starting anew. Socialism takes the massively developed productive forces of society, the forces that have created the potential for a world of superabundance for all, and takes them from the dying hands of the capitalists and puts it into the hands of the working class, not for profit, but for the needs of humanity. We can plan the economy and do away with overproduction, waste, and anarchy. We can produce in common and consume in common based on needs and abilities rather than exchange and exploitation. We will no longer, under communism, be producing commodities for the sake of sale, but use values in common for common consumption. Money will no longer be necessary as a means of exchange, which will no longer be the basis of production and consumption. People will no longer be competing for jobs and profits, but will work together for a common stockpile of goods and services for those who produce the society. But only socialist revolution and the institution of a democratic workers' government can accomplish this. Capitalism itself has created a working class who work together to produce society. They come together every day at work and experience the same exploitation by the same class of capitalists. But there must be a party that can explain this exploitation of the workers, which is the only way that we're going to overthrow capitalism and bring about socialism. Thank you, comrades.
Communists of America is a podcast produced by our party, the Revolutionary Communists of America. If you agree with what was said in this podcast and you want to get organized, go to communistusa.org/join.
It's 2012. The Greek government is indebted to the tune of 300 billion euros. Greece is rocked by general strikes, mass protest, and street fighting. Georgios Karatsaferis, a right-wing politician, comments anxiously that if the situation continues, Greece will be the fire that will ignite the European revolution.
A specter is haunting Europe. The specter of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
I'll guarantee that 10 minutes from now, a lot of you are going to have a new understanding of communism.
Welcome to the Spectre of Communism. 10 years ago, in 2015, a revolution in Greece was portrayed. How did this happen, and what are the lessons that revolutionaries and class fighters need to learn today? To help us answer these questions and more, we have with us Francesco Merli, who is a member of the International Secretariat of the Revolutionary Communist International. Francesco, it's really great to have you on the show.
Thank you.
So, before we get into the background to the movement in Greece, the crisis that precipitated the revolution, and why it was ultimately led to betrayal, why are these events important?
Well, first of all, it's the aftermath of the 2008 crisis and the impact it had on Europe and the advanced capitalist countries finds its way, let's say, the weak link in Greece. So it's the beginning of a process that then is affecting the whole of Europe and beyond Europe, of course, that we can see at play in Greece, and it reaches the point of posing the question of who decides in society, who is ruling, and for what interests. And the answer to this question was not given in a way, or it was given in a negative way. We can learn a lot from these processes, because a revolution, that's what we're talking about, that engulfed Greece and went beyond Greece, had then important consequences on the lives we're living in today.
So, this movement occurred in the context of the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, which, really speaking, represented an organic crisis of capitalism. And looking at the metrics for this channel, I happen to know that it was a formative political event or political period for most of the people who are watching and listening. Certainly it was for me. I remember that time very well. And I remember how inspirational the struggle that the Greek people put up against the austerity measures foisted upon them by the institutions of European capitalism in particular was. But let's talk about this crisis. This episode isn't about the 2008 crisis, but it is a necessary backdrop to the events in Greece. So, what was the 2008 financial crisis, and what impact did it have in Greece?
Well, Greece was the weak link. So, it was preceded by an orgy, you can call it that way, of speculation that had at the center, it was affecting the whole world, but in the case of Greece, it did affect their banking system. The banking system was riding too high, in fact, for the strength of the Greek economy. For many years before 2008, the Greek banking system racked up record profits, and it was in fact the most profitable banking system in the whole of the European Union for several years in that period. So it was attracting and expanding, and it was bubble speculation, in fact. And that all came to a sudden and swift end with 2008. What happened was, with the subprime crisis, subprime mortgage crisis starting from the US, the collapse of Lehman Brothers and other financial institutions forced all governments to step in and bail out the capitalist system in order to prevent its meltdown. And that happened in Greece as well, because the problem was that the whole Greek banking system, all of a sudden, which was overexposed, overheated, let's say, inflated, all of a sudden there's access to the capital markets was cut off, like all the rest. And therefore, the Greek government had to had to intervene in salvaging what was left of the banking system with a bailout. And that had disastrous consequences. Like everywhere else, the state was socializing the losses of the capitalists. But in the case of Greece, of course, the state was weaker, had less resources, and therefore Greece became the weak link in the capitalist chain.
We should say that the government responsible in 2009, 2010 for carrying out this intervention, this bailout, was a PASOK government of Georgios Papandreou,
Yeah.
which is the Greek Labour Party, in effect, right? The traditional left-wing or centre-left Social Democratic Party.
Yeah, the PASOK was the main left-wing party, let's say traditional party in Greece, and was in a government. Well, actually, they won the elections that led them to power with a landslide. It was, and this government had to deal with that situation and carried out as under the pressure of the capitalist system. They carried out the bailout, and therefore took on the state debt as state debt, what was basically this black hole that was had been created by the capitalists in the banking system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a 28 billion euro bailout, and the government was forced to announce a budget deficit of 12.5%. The international rating agencies downgraded Greece's credit rating, so it was harder and more expensive to borrow. And in the end, the government was having to borrow at rates of 10% just to pay off the interest on its debt, which, as I said in the intro, had swelled to something like 300 billion euros. So it was eye-watering. And I think it's important that we talk about the social consequences of the austerity measures that were demanded of Greece as a result of the money being lent that was imposed upon the Greek people in order to service this massive mountain of debt. So just how bad did things get in this period?
Well, the first year or so, the government is just attempting to resist this enormous pressure. Why is Greece? I mean, all governments did the same everywhere. That was the case in France, was the case in Britain, it was the case in the United States. But Greece was standing out because it was the weak link, and therefore it became a target for financial speculation and speculations on the financing of this enormous debt. So the sovereign debt crisis was not affecting just Greece. It was affecting Spain, it was affecting Italy at the time. France was becoming more and more close to these levels, but Greece was the first target. So what the government had to face, the Papandreou government, was basically, the whole of the international speculation piling onto Greece. And the result was that they didn't introduce immediately austerity measures, but these were introduced soon enough in 1 year or so. And the impact on that was dramatic because the austerity measures that were needed in order to finance the payment of these, or just the interest, not the debt itself, this 10% borrowing rates that they were forced to pay in order to get more financing for the debt that was just opening up a black hole. As time was passing by, it meant that the Greek state had to cut all sorts of expenses, from schools, social security, pensions, healthcare, to the bone, to a point where, of course, the impact on people's lives was dramatic.
Mm. Well, I have a few statistics here, which are also cited in an article from the Defense of Marxism Theoretical magazine, which in issue 50 carried a lead article about the lessons of Greece. It says that the country's GDP declined by 27%, so almost a third. Average disposable income fell by almost 40%. Pensions were slashed in half. Unemployment reached 27% in 2013. Basic social services essentially collapsed. It's compared to the situation following a war. The Greek economy and the lives of the Greek people were absolutely ravaged in this period between 2008 and 2013.
Yeah, they were devastating. And of course, these high unemployment levels were almost, we're talking about 27%, but, the whole of the economic activities, the catastrophic collapse in consumption, the recession, the economic activities, the shops were closing. This had like a snowballing effect on the whole of the economy, and the results were devastating.
I think it's also worth mentioning that in order to justify the measures that were being forced upon Greece by its creditors and also the measures that were to come, there was slander spread in the European press, in the international press, and I remember this because it was coming out in Britain, that the Greeks are just a lazy, profligate people, that they've been dragging their heels, and this was basically just desserts for taking particularly the richer northern European countries for a ride for years and living beyond their means. But this is, disgustingly reactionary, but even on the level of basic logic and on the face of the evidence is completely false. I've got one statistic here which shows that in the decade up to 2005, so that's from 1995 to 2005, Greek workers worked the most hours per day of any working class of any country in Europe, at an average of 1,900 hours per worker, followed by Spain. So this myth of the lazy Greek workers that was spread around to justify the terrible situation that Greek people were being forced to endure. We should also say that the Greek capitalists, the Greek bankers, have made an absolute killing in the past period. They weren't being made to pay for this. The Greek bourgeoisie weren't being made to pay for this situation. It was the ordinary Greek workers who've been working as hard or harder than anybody else in Europe in that period who had to pay.
Yeah, and that's precisely what happened. Was a widespread campaign that, of course, couldn't cut through, and couldn't convince the Greeks themselves, but it did was carried out in a ruthless way throughout Europe to justify the treatment of Greece by the hands of the European Central Bank, what would become the group of lenders, those who decided the fate of Greece, and that was a vicious campaign which held responsible the whole of the Greek population for this state of the Greek economy. And they had no say whatsoever, like in any other country, about what the capitalist class, their respective capitalist classes, were doing. And the problem was created by a speculative bubble that benefited the capitalists in Greece and the European capitalists as well. And the bill of the crisis that came out of it was presented to the Greek working class.
Mm-hmm. I think that we should talk about a name that you'll hear a lot throughout this episode, which is the Troika, which was basically the figurehead that was leading the economic assault on the Greek people. So what exactly is the Troika?
Well, the Troika was a group of international institutions that became the lenders, became the ones bailing out Greece, the Greek government, in that situation. And they came in 2010 by bailing out, I can't remember now the figure, but they bailed out the Greek state, providing finance in exchange for reforms, or rather counter-reforms and cuts. So they wanted to stabilize Greece. That was the narrative of this. In fact, what they wanted was to use Greece as a deterrent. They wanted to make an example of Greece. And we have to keep in mind that the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and
the European Commission,
and the European Commission,
so the three institutions,
the three institutions that were making up the Troika, they had in mind a scenario where everywhere the sovereign debt could become a focal point for a crisis, and they wanted to cauterize. That's what they did. This wound that was opening up in Greece and prevent the contagion, the economic contagion, to spread to other more important economies.
Yes.
So they wanted to make an example of Greece so that would be repeated in Italy or Spain.
Yeah, that's a very important point, because this is something which comes out of the article in the IDOM written by Arturo Rodriguez that I mentioned earlier. The actual value, the absolute terms value of the Greek debt was comparatively small in real terms, relative to the actual economic weight of the EU and its institutions. But if Greece wasn't made to pay, if Greece was able to escape having to pay, then it would have been an example to all the other countries, which, as you say, were affected by the same debt crisis that afflicted the entire continent. The other thing we should say is this situation wasn't happening in total isolation. There was social turmoil occurring elsewhere in the world. 2011, you had the revolution in the Middle East, and it was a period where the Occupy movement was underway in some of the advanced capitalist countries. This rebellion against austerity that was beginning to take shape. So it was a period of social turmoil, as well as one where the economic situation was precarious. So the capitalists were determined to ensure that Greece didn't become a positive example to the workers of the world. Because the other thing we should say is that not only did the Greek workers work very hard, in contradiction to the slander, they also fought very hard in this period. Between 2010 and 2014, there were mass demonstrations. There were almost 40 general strikes over that period. Neighbourhood struggles, grassroots organising. The Greek people fought against this economic assault tooth and nail.
Yeah. I mean, at the beginning, the kind of overall sentiment was that of surprise, and most people were stunned by these attacks. They were frontal attacks to their conditions of life, but they couldn't see any way to resist that. But then, the impact of these measures began more and more clear. It became more evident, and therefore, in the spring of 2011, we have the explosion of a wave of mass demonstrations, which start not even in Greece. Actually, the first real mass movement that is developing is the Indignados movement in Spain, 15th of May 2011. And of course, as you mentioned, there was the revolution in North Africa, in the Middle East, that brought down the regimes that were seemed to be invincible, and like Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, or the Tunisian dictator, were brought down by revolutions, and that had sent shockwaves throughout the world, and it contributed in kind of waking up the resistance against austerity in Europe. It played a role, and of course we have the development of the movement in Spain, and then 10 days later, on the 25th of May, we have a mass gathering in Syntagma Square in front of the Greek parliament. And the occupation of Syntagma Square starts a movement that is structuring in all neighborhoods with massive popular assemblies. And this is like, it's the first indication that the masses are entering the stage with a resistance, with a movement and an alternative, because this movement is also proposing a program. They have demands, and they elaborate these demands through collective discussion. And there is an element of workers' democracy in this movement, with delegates being elected and recalled to the superior instances of these popular assemblies. So in the space of a few weeks, you have the development of a massive, the real beginnings of the Greek Revolution.
Yeah, and we should emphasize that point. This wasn't just a normal protest movement.
No.
This was a revolutionary movement. I mean, what is a revolution? It's the point where the masses enter the stage of history and begin to take their own destinies into their hands, and that's what you started to see take shape in Greece.
So we'll come back to that video tomorrow. We just did the daily routine of meditation, reading, yoga, and martial arts workout. Now I'm going to go for a run. Each of these blocks is 30 minutes. I encourage you, if you're just tuning in, to go to the beginning and follow along with me, practice with me, and develop your own daily routine. This will always be free, so please like, share, and subscribe.